and welcome to Dungeons & Drama Nerds. I'm Nick Orvis, and I'm here this week with CJ Linton.
Hello.
CJ is the GM of our Kids on Bikes campaign, which is airing right now. We're going to talk a little bit about theater, a little bit about tabletop games, and about the game of Kids on Bikes that he's running for us. Thanks for joining us, CJ.
Of course, super lovely to be here.
To start off, our listeners should know that CJ is a multi-talented, multi-hyphenate artist. He's a writer, a dramaturg, which we are always a huge fan of, and a tabletop game designer whose work includes, most recently, Tomorrow on Revelation 3 with Dominique Dickey, and Those of Us Who Know Better. So, CJ, I was wondering, could you talk to us a little bit about how you came to work in both theater and tabletop games? Because that is obviously an overlap that we're all very interested in.
Yes, I feel like there are so many people who live in both of those worlds. So for both of these things, I actually fell into them a little bit later, kind of by accident, and then got really into it. I was not a theater kid in high school. My family went to plays growing up sometimes, but it was something that I started doing when I got to college. There was a theater group at my university who needed a stage manager, and I learned what a stage manager was and was like, that is something I could probably do. And then I did, and I ended up being they called the role executive producer, which was like a combination managing director, production manager role for that theater group for 2 years, and actually did not get into dramaturgy until towards the very end of college. There was a moment in my life where I was like, I want nothing more than to be an English professor, but the academy is terrible. And then I found out you could be an English professor for theater rehearsals. So tried to do that instead, which of course is, as I'm sure you're aware, such an easier industry to be in.
Absolutely. Dramaturgy money is famously easy to get.
So I do a little bit of freelancing these days. And then tabletop games, I think I tried like one session of one D&D campaign when I was younger, and then didn't play seriously again until college. My now partner, Liz, invited me to join a D&D campaign, and everyone in our group sort of got into tabletop games so much that I started a cyberpunk campaign that I ran until I graduated. And then in my first theater apprenticeship out of college, I ran a cyberpunk campaign for those folks. And when the pandemic started, I think that was kind of a tabletop renaissance is not the word I'm looking for, but a lot of people turned to tabletop games. And I just started digitally running a lot of tabletop games for a lot of people. And there were probably a couple of weeks where I was like running a different game every night for different groups of people. And that was when I really got into GMing. I think it's something that all GMs do, where you see your players responding to some parts of a game more than others, and you make those little shifts without consciously thinking about that as modifying a game or as game design. And then the more I was doing that with different systems, that was when I sort of shifted from maybe what you could think of as like home brewing and table rules to actually designing my own games.
I'm really curious about this as somebody who's interested in game design, but not really a game designer and also works in theater. Do you feel like your work in theater and tabletop gaming inform one another in any way, or do they feel like separate parts of your world to you?
Oh, I think there's no way that it can't, because it's a communal story creation experience. Not for actual plays, but for home games specifically, it's like a very tiny communal storytelling experience where your players are like both the audience and the actors. And there are just some things about that feel very theater to me. And then there are obviously some things that aren't. And then being a dramaturg definitely has made me a better GM and a better game designer in terms of asking questions about what the people involved in the experience are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that skill of sussing out sort of what the purpose that the room has come together for is so valuable in both of those roles.
For sure.
And in some ways under deployed in both roles, I feel like, or certainly in the worlds of tabletop game and theater.
Yeah, I think in like all of those, like a question I'm always interested in for the people that the experience is centering, whether that's like just the playwright or for like tabletop games, that's everybody in the room. You're coming together and having a communal experience, and everyone should be having a good time and be happy with the story you're creating. Like, I think identifying what do we want to be doing here is so useful and so easy to get away from.
Do you feel I'm jumping around a little bit, but how do you think of your role as a dramaturg in the rehearsal hall?
Yeah.
Is that what you view as your kind of primary job, or your role is to what you were just describing of seeing what the people at the center of the process want?
I think it really depends on every show I've done dramaturgy for has been so distinct. So like there are some instances where it feels like you do have a really active role in the rehearsal room, and you're kind of you're asking questions in that active way. And I think there are other instances where a lot of the people there have a really good sense of what they want and are like able to create that for themselves, and it doesn't really necessitate that level of involvement from the dramaturg. I feel like knowing when your voice is not needed is also a very important rehearsal hall skill.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned playwrights earlier. Have you mostly worked in that kind of new play development, like working with writers? World of theater?
I've kind of done both. I've worked with a couple playwrights on like very early drafts of the thing. And then I've also done dramaturgy for productions where, not that there's, I would say there's always something a dramaturg can add, but like I've done dramaturgy for Cabaret, and that it like we're not developing that script. What you're trying to provide to that rehearsal room looks very, very different. So, and I enjoy both, but just like identifying what is actually the very different things that you hold, I think has been fun for all of that.
Yeah, we've talked on the podcast before about like tabletop games being like devised theater, and I really do feel like in both art forms there's such an enormous range, you know, everything from like on the one hand the very hierarchized, I guess I'll say, for lack of a better word, systems in both tabletop games where you're looking at the like, you know, the kind of traditional dungeon master's screen and like one person with all the information, or in theater, the sort of regional theater model where there's like the playwright and the director, and one or the other or both of them are in charge and everybody else kind of works for them and they work for the theater. And then on the other hand, you know, everything from like lyric games to devised processes and collective creation is just really, it's such a huge range. I think it can be challenging in an exciting way to negotiate every time. Like what role am I best serving in this process?
And I think there's a lot more freedom in the tabletop games realm, at least in terms of hierarchy, because I know a lot of people who play D&D who there is that system and that like hierarchy and idea of what it is to be a GM and player that lives in that game text. And then you have people playing games that they consider D&D. And I think if someone thinks a game is D&D, it is fair for them to call it that. But that look very different from that text. So finding ways to like innovate and make, I think, those very stereotypical, like this is what a tabletop game looks like for them. And even just the act of like Wizards of the Coast writes hundreds and hundreds of pages of books about the D&D world. I don't run or play D&D, so I don't know very much. I couldn't even tell you what any of the continents are. But there are still people that go and create their whole other worlds to play D&D in, and I think there's something very cool about that.
Yeah. Well, it's so accessible for anybody to create in a way that theater is actually still relatively accessible for an art form, because you just need like people and a place. But, it can be harder for people to feel like, oh, yeah, I can just go make theater than like I can, play this game with 5 friends at home is a pretty like easy thing to start to feel like you can get into.
Yeah. There's that the audience question. It's like, are you fundamentally creating the same thing if it is not on a stage with the idea of an assumed audience? Whereas unless you're doing an actual play where you're trying to have an audience of some kind, just a home game doesn't have that consideration.
Well, speaking of actual plays, you've given me a very good segue. Thank you. I wanted to ask, we're recording this kind of halfway through the playing of Kids on Bikes. So I was curious if you could talk to me a little bit about what you're hoping to do with this game. What excites you about this system, about these characters, this town in Pennsylvania that you've all collectively come up with? What has got your creative juices flowing right now?
Yeah, well, I really like Kids on Bikes as a system, but also just the way that the book is designed. I think it's really intuitive and lovely. The fact that, and there are the quick start modules and pre-generated settings at the back, and we opted not to go with those and make our own. And just the way that the game invites very specifically everybody to contribute pieces of it is really exciting. And I consider session 0 and character creation like you're already playing the game. You're just kind of in a phase of gameplay setup. Like you're entering the shared storytelling piece of the game with a shared understanding that you came to together. And that's awesome for the story, but it's also wonderful for the players to get to know each other and feel comfortable and kind of have a sense of what excites each other. So like any system that sets that up is very exciting to me. And then like the players are amazing, and they did a great job making this charming and wacky and extremely specific town. So there are, like, I couldn't have asked for better little hooks and things to sort of craft an adventure out of. So I'm super excited, like truly everything about it. I couldn't be happier.
Excellent. And speaking of those hooks, you have done some really incredibly incredible work on like I don't know if fleshing out is exactly the right word, but on like tracking and supporting all of these choices that you and the players made. There are these amazing pick crews of all of the NPCs, and I know just from following you on Twitter that you do some similar stuff in your Cyberpunk game at home as well. Can you talk to me a little bit about why that level of detail and like organization is important to you, and also just as a very disorganized person, how you keep track of everything for these games?
Yeah, I will say that it doesn't feel like that much work to me, because most of the stuff that I'm tracking are things that the players are coming up with, and sometimes I'm writing it like frantically longhand and then typing it up later, but it feels easy to do because we created it together. And it feels just like having the documentation for things that are a shared understanding piece. Something that I have a hard time with crunchier tabletop games is when it's so hard to keep track of all of the information and the things that you sort of need to know outside of the game to play the game, that it begins to impede the gameplay experience. So for any game I'm running where it's going to be more than a one shot, I think it's just useful to have all of that compiled for people to reference. It's like it's sort of the question of like whenever you're playing a character who is not exactly you, like you don't need to be an expert cryptographer to play an expert cryptographer in a tabletop game. So I'm always thinking about for things on a setting level, like if your character grew up in this neighborhood and has the ability to competently navigate the neighborhood in that way, what can I as a GM do to help you do that in a way that is fun and supports the type of game you want to be doing? And a lot of time that's just like having neatly laid out reference documents for people to be like, oh yeah, I only play this character 3 hours a week, so I don't necessarily remember the name of every NPC that I've interacted with, but that character would. And I just use Google Docs. We have, for every campaign I've run, there's like a Google Drive folder with all of the little documents, and depending on how expansive it is, for the Cyberpunk campaign, we have a subfolder within the folder that is just pick-roos of the dozens and dozens of NPCs that the players have met. So that's a whole level of a thing. But I think for most games, like if you just have a list of the stuff you mutually decided on, that's great.
Yeah. And I love the ethos, and it feels very dramaturgical to me, of like information transparency and like accessibility maybe is the word I'm looking for. I feel like so much of our job as dramaturgs is about making sure people have the information that's not just useful in a sort of utilitarian way, but actually is generative and like helps them create character or live in a character or live in a particular world. So that
for
feels
sure. It's so grounded in like what is this thing that I am creating going to do to help you have, in the case of tabletop games, like a more fulfilling narrative experience. And then obviously in the rehearsal room, it's like you can do infinite research, but what of that research is what the playwright is looking for and is going to help them with whatever they want to be doing with their piece.
Yeah, it's not. I was just sorry. This is a little bit me reflecting on my own process too as a dramaturg, but I was going to say it is not always helpful to deliver like all of the information or, the kind of maximal amount, which immediately made me think of the sort of stereotype of the like home brewing fantasy GM who's like, let's play a game of D&D. Here's my like 500-page treatise on the like Tolkien-esque history of the world that I've created and all that thing. But yeah. And I don't want to knock that, because that is the perfect game for some people and some absolutely
GMs, but I'm not that GM. And I also try not to create like so much information that I can't keep track of it. I'm all for really rich immersive world building, and I think that's what a lot of players look for, but I don't think that necessarily looks like the GM deciding every detail. Like even when you're in a game session and someone's like, let's go to a coffee shop, if the coffee shop doesn't exist yet, I think there's a school of tabletop playing thought that is like the GM needs to come up with that and immediately create that and provide it to the players. And there's another way to play that's like, what do we as the table think the coffee shop is named? And we can pause and think about like, why is the character going here? What do we want to happen in this scene? And have that actually be fun for the game instead of me just scrambling to make up like space lattes.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of space, can you talk to me a little bit about tomorrow on Revelation 3? It is. Am I correct in saying that it is your most recently released game?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so people can find it on itch. And is there somewhere else that you're selling it, or
it'll be on Drive-Thru RPG at some point. We haven't gotten around to setting up the page yet, but it'll be there at some point.
It'll be there soon.
Yes.
But it is a game about surviving capitalism, but in space. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit about your process of working on that with, as I said before, Dominique Dickey, And also what kind of motivated you to create this game?
For sure. So I actually sort of started off dramaturging this game a little bit before I became the co-designer. They were telling me about this idea they had to create a game about farmers in space who were trying to avoid becoming obsolete because their work was going to become automated. And as I was sort of, we have a lot of phone calls where they're like, they have so many amazing ideas, and I'm very excited to work with them on all of them. But sort of asking like, what excites you about this and why like this specific shape for this project? And what we sort of came to was we didn't want to create a game where it was implied that it would be a bad thing to become obsolete. So for the narrative to be just like survival and living within the system is certainly a story that people experience every day. But is that going to be a fun tabletop game? And so then the question became like, do you want to write this as a short story, or is this game going to become something different? And we went with the something different. And that was when we sort of reconceptualized it as a bigger system with a whole station, and the farming is a big part of Revelation 3, which is the space station it takes place on. But there's a whole kind of rich economic life and very insidious system that the conceit of the game is that the player characters have come together as a group to try to change and improve that. And then in terms of process, we kind of talked about all of the different ways we could do it on like a very high conceptual level, down to like what die do we want to base the system in, until we felt ready to write, and then went through a few drafts of that and went from there.
It's a really fascinating game. I have not quite finished reading the whole game manual, but everything I've read so far I've really loved. I will also say this episode is going to come out a little too late. But if you're still feeling spooky when you're listening to this episode, everybody should also check out CJ's Bring Down the House, which is a game where you play a haunted object who ruins lives. And I absolutely loved reading that game the other day, and I wish I had somebody to play it with on Halloween, which is just a few days after we're recording.
Thank you. I'm actually running it tomorrow. So that was the first game I designed, and there are some things I'm like, oh, I would do that so differently. Now, the layout is
sure.
I don't want to say atrocious, but we've learned a lot about layout in the intervening period. But it's thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed.
No, of course. I mean, I feel like that's always the same thing goes for me for like certainly anything I wrote more than a year ago.
For sure.
Anytime I go back and look at it, I'm like, oh God, oh no, really? I'm going to say that, but you know, we live and we learn, and it's still a really, really like charming, delightful, spooky game. So
thank you.
Like I said before, we're still kind of in process on Kids on Bikes, but I was curious if there's anything so far in the story that whether this is like the mechanics, whether the mechanics have like not quite done what you expected them to do, or if there's anything that specific players or characters have done that has really like surprised / delighted / shocked you. Just like what I feel like we always, everybody agrees that no imagined plan survives contact with the players. So I'm just curious how that's been manifesting for you in this process.
It's been really delightful. A few different things have surprised me. I expected us to be rolling dice more, which I never should, because I feel like even with games where there are a lot of dice, the players aren't always rolling dice a lot. But there's a lot of really good role play and moments where it feels like a contested role is not needed, which is always super exciting. The transition to the powered character has been really fun and interesting. For folks who are not familiar with Kids on Bikes, there is a character with supernatural powers who the players and the GM communally control. And a lot of the players come from D&D backgrounds where that kind of shared NPC or shared setting component or anything like that is not native to the game. So I think we did 2 episodes where I was playing this character, even though everyone had their components that they were technically controlling before I more formally kind of pushed them to be using that. And so it was really fun to sort of watch players begin to be more comfortable with saying, actually, I do own this piece of the game that I normally wouldn't have my hands in. And that can be really fun and exciting. And then also just the last thing is that the characters are kids, and we opened on a scene with a worker at a silicon chip manufacturing plant, and these kids just absolutely giving him the worst time. And that was so fun to role play. And there's something so distinct. I've played and run Monster Hearts before. I've played and run games with teenagers, but just the specific portrayals of kids and the way that kind of changed the game. Like it truly would be a different game if we were playing with a different age group, and the players are doing a beautiful job kind of walking that line of like coming of age story. So it's great. It's been really good.
It's really been a delight to listen to. and you're absolutely right. I think the story with a different age group would feel and be entirely different. So I'm really glad that we landed on this game, because it's been really cool to listen to. And just circling back a little, I also wanted to say I've been thinking a lot about transparency recently, and I don't think that people will have heard this when this interview releases, but I don't think it's a spoiler either. You were talking about the powered character, and you did something in the gameplay that I thought was really great, which was when you kind of gave them that transition, you kind of told them explicitly, okay, I've given you all these, the system for Kids on Bikes is that with the powered character, the GM kind of hands out individual aspects of the character so that each player controls a couple aspects. And there was a point where you said to them, okay, I'm going to step back from controlling this character now so that you all can take that over. And I just thought that was such a lovely, I think a lot of kind of traditions or like norms in tabletop GMing, and also sometimes in like directing. I also have a background as a director, so that's something I think about a lot, have subtle undercurrents of like manipulation to them. So I'm always like I'm always so enthusiastic when I see GMs and directors like communicating clearly and just making those game mechanics explicit in that way. So I thought that was great to see.
Thank you. I think it also just helps people feel empowered to actually use the mechanics if they know why something is shifting. I run into that a lot with like world building details too, where there are some players who are like, these are my 18 NPCs that are associated with my character, and something that would be fun for me would be to watch you play them. And then there are some players who are like, this is my character, I don't really care, come up with like stuff for me, I'm excited to see what you do. And neither of those things are the wrong or right way to do it. But just having that explicit conversation with each player about like what is useful and fun for you, I think makes everyone's gameplay experience so much better than were I to just be like, I don't know, you guys figure it out. I'm doing something different than I was doing 30 minutes ago, but I haven't explained why. So
yeah, all about communication. We love communication. Great. Well, as we wrap up here, CJ, do you have any other projects coming up that our listeners should know about? And where can people find you and follow your work online?
For sure.
Or in meat space as well, if there's somewhere they can follow your work in the real world.
So my next tabletop project is I am editing and project managing Dominique Dickey's next game, which is called Plant Girl Game. And it is about a witch that grows plant children in her garden, and then those plant children go to middle school. So super excited to get to work on that. And it will be on Kickstarter as part of Zine Quest early next year. And then I have a couple other written things coming up that I don't think will have been announced by the time this episode drops, but you can follow me on Itch and Twitter at Near Futures, and my website, cjlinton.com, for any work and project updates and things.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us, CJ. And I'm having a blast listening in as you all play Kids on Bikes, and I hope everybody out there listening is too. You can tune back in to Dungeons and Drama Nerds next week to continue hearing our campaign of Kids on Bikes. Thanks, CJ.
Thank you.
Dungeons and Drama Nerds is produced by Todd Brian Backus, Percival Hornak, and Nicholas Orvis, and is mixed and edited by Anthony Sertel D. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at DN Drama Nerds. Check out cast bios on our website, dungeonsanddramanerds.com, and tune in next week for another episode of Dungeons and Drama Nerds.